talk a little bit about, I don't understand how they operated with impunity and in the radar instead of under the radar, and things like the Fugitive Slave Act. How did they do this when it was illegal?
Well, think about, I'm trying to think of a good example here, but think about, now, we all grew through the 60s, right? Think about the SDS. The Weathermen SDS, for instance. They were doing some things that were illegal. But as far as meeting, gathering, publishing information, going from place to place, that's all legal. And those are all things for which they would not presumably be.
They could do this publicly as long as they didn't get caught.
There were some things they did that were legal, that they did, and that sometimes they stirred up a lot of antipathy from those who opposed those ideas. You know, if you read back through stories of various sorts, the formation of the New York, it's called the New York Anti-Slavery Society in Utica. You know, they were going to have a convention, and the good citizens of the day said, those terrible abolitionists, they're going to be stirring up trouble and disturbing the public order. Let's go throw rocks at the building. Because they're having a problem. So let's go throw rocks at the building. This sounds familiar, right? It's kind of a bunch of Baptists in a church praying and mob gathers outside, you know, the same kind of thing. So, so that kind of thing happened with some degree of frequency, the conflict between groups and ideas. And so even the things such as assisting a fugitive, which would have been a felonious offense, would have gotten you jail time, etc. That was something that was directly illegal. So in that case, that's something the law enforcement people would be after you for. But other than that, having a meeting, talking about it, that's just something your neighbors might be upset with you about. And we actually have a host of examples.
Just following up on that, which I thought was a good question. Wouldn't the slave catchers just go to 94 Lumber Street?
Well, you would think so, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
There's a picture that we we have too many pictures, so we pulled some out. But of the city of Albany and the showing the city from across the river, and you can see all the buildings there, and way off on the side, there's a group of buildings, kind of like a road going up the side of the hill, and there's a cluster of trees and whatnot. We figured this was where Arbor Hill was at that time, which is where 194 Lumber Street, 194 Livingston, 198 Lumber Street would have been. And it was really off the beaten path. And so, two things. I mean, one is that, first off, somebody had to, usually with the flyers, they were sort of public, but you weren't necessarily giving them to everybody. Giving them to people that you thought were supporters. So they would have to get the information first, and then have the wherewithal to kind of seek it out and have a sense of where things were in the city. So there was a concern, all right, but people also felt that they were taking a stand, and trying to agitate to develop support, etc.
Maybe a case in point, though, as well. The 1851 Syracuse.
The Jerry Rescue.
The Jerry Rescue was actually prosecuted. It was a set. The rescue itself was set in Syracuse. The prosecution of the case was held here in Albany at
City Hall.
And the people, how many people were being prosecuted?
Something like 30-some people were indicted. And only 2 of them were actually brought to trial, and neither one of them went to jail. Right. Only one, I think, was convicted. And so
the rest of the questions at the end.
We get more. So anyway, here's some newspapers. Movement, not safe houses. So the Underground Railroad, we like to use this idea of movement rather than, there are other definitions you've probably heard of the Underground Railroad. A string of safe houses, routes, secret pathways, things like that. But it was really a movement, and by movement, we're all generally familiar with this idea of movement, that there are lots of different organizations that have different goals and different interests that have a common focus or a common theme. And so there are the number of churches that are identified here. There are secular organizations, political groups. We mentioned the Eastern New York Anti-Slavery Society as one group. There were numerous others of various stripes, and these are 3 or 4 angles at which this subject was approached that are tied into the Underground Railroad. You might want to say, well, it's part of the larger abolitionist movement, but of course not all abolitionists were into the immediate end of slavery. So, and that's why we kind of focus on some of these. Did you want to touch on these?
Yeah, just to mention, I'd like to mention John Brown here at this point. Again, he's a very popular figure in the retelling of this history. And yet, John Brown followed, if you will, in the footsteps of people like Nat Turner and Gabriel Prosser, people who were forerunners of the immediate dissolution of this institution of slavery. Today we might call John Brown and others who preceded him as terrorists. They were very much interested in both taking up arms and the immediate elimination of this institution. So certainly their style is not far removed from things that we're familiar with today. But yet this was part and parcel of the efforts part of a movement to abolish this institution. Harriet Beecher Stowe is pictured there, again, a latecomer to the scene when you think about narratives like, who did we show before? Harriet Jacobs, I'm sorry. Harriet Jacobs' narrative and others, for instance. Certainly Harriet Beecher Stowe was not first-person narrative, but nonetheless, she represents, again, as I say, as a latecomer to this history, those who took written word as a way to both educate and persuade people to understand the reality of and the horrendous violence embedded in this institution, and do something to actively change it, to eliminate it from its being. We have the Great Liberty Convention. There were a number of people who felt that the effort to organize bodies together was a very effective strategy for, again, eliminating this institution. And then that sort of rolled itself over into political system occasions. We have the Liberty Party, the Free Soil Party, and eventually the Republican Party.
Yeah.
Got that order right. So people were coming at the abolition of this institution through multiple avenues. So they were working at, our preference is to talk about people taking these strategies and applying them in concert with, if you will, people like Stephen and Harriet Myers and William Henry Johnson and so on, who were actually providing front-runner assistance to freedom seekers. The other piece of this movement was that of the use of music, and again, for all of our histories, I'm sure we're well aware of the significance music plays, both in education, of content related to, in this case, the Underground Railroad movement, the abolition effort, the anti-slavery efforts, and the opportunity again to persuade people and rally people to the cause, touch those emotional heartstrings and get people to move and act. And actually, George Washington Clark, G.W. Clark, George Washington Clark was an Albany resident who was a musician in his own right. And he was kind enough to collect music of the period. He wrote some of his own, collected music of the period as well. Very secular music, secular in character, that actually he collected and published in some hardbound volumes that are currently held by the New York State Library. So again, a treasure trove of an opportunity, if you will, to touch the life of the people of this period.
Yeah, and I'll just take a minute to run through a line here. This one is called My Country. Right? A lot of tunes from the period were sung to familiar tunes. Mm-hmm. My country, 'tis for the dark land of slavery, for thee I weep. Just give you an idea. The role of African Americans in securing freedom. Everybody generally, of course, the story itself is a story about freedom seekers, African people who were enslaved, who made their way to freedom. But there are a great many people who were involved in the leadership end of the Underground Railroad story. And this, of course, is Stephen Myers. He was born in Rensselaer County in 1800. Freed somewhere around the age of 18, active in anti-slavery work in the early 1830s, edited a whole number of newspapers that unfortunately very few of the editions actually survive to us today. The New York State Library does have some of them. He was an agent for the Vigilance Committee in the late 1840s and through the 1850s, and really was a very central person in the region in terms of the Underground Railroad story. Henry Highland Garnett, a person whose father brought him out of enslavement in the 1820s, eventually settled in the upstate region, was involved in ministerial work, and was pastor of the Liberty Street Presbyterian Church in Troy. You can see as he went through in his life, toward the end of his life, he was president of Avery College and was appointed minister to Liberia just before his death in 1881. So that's a diplomatic sort of post. So you can see a real range, and oftentimes you ask that question, well, what happened to the people that were, escaping? Well, here's a story, him and his family came out of enslavement in Maryland, made their way into New Jersey, lived in New Jersey for a while, then New York City, and eventually upstate New York. William Henry Johnson, another individual, and that's not the guy that our Henry Johnson Boulevard is named after, but he came to Albany in 1851. He was here for a period of time, went away, then came back, continued to live here into the early 20th century, did a book called The Autobiography of William Henry Johnson, and he had a lot of pictures in the book, and that's where we get a lot of these pictures from, of him, Stephen Myers, Thomas Elkins, Sarah Johnson, and some others. What was that? He was a barber. That's why it was important his hair kind of moved down,
One of the things that William Henry Johnson does tell us in his autobiography is that he chose to come to the city of Albany to work alongside of those who were already here to on the abolition of the institution of slavery. So it's a very deliberate choice. Women's involvement in this movement, as I mentioned earlier, it has been very difficult to uncover details about women's involvement. I often think it's because they were so busy about the business of abolition and assisting freedom seekers, they didn't write about themselves like the men did. But nonetheless, they, from what little stories we have been able to uncover, we have been able to learn, as with the letter here, the Harriet letter that I shared with you earlier, and from some of the other documents, that in fact these women were very much frontline workers. They were welcoming freedom seekers into their homes. Obviously, in this mid-19th century period, it was culturally unacceptable for women to be doing this. It was culturally unacceptable for them to be out and about publicly in the community. The old hearth and home mentality was very much part and parcel of the culture in which these women were living. And yet they did have their sewing circles and they had their knitting circles. And if we want to talk terrorist cells today, well, let's look at it. These were the prime occasions for organizing, for conversations, for self-education, and so on. And these women were on it. And it was through, but then again, in a very tangible, sort of practical way, those knitting circles, those sewing circles were able to be put to use for fundraising, for raising funds both to support the newspapers that the men were trying to publish, but weren't always the best financiers to do it. But they were also raising funds to support freedom seekers who were coming into the communities to seek assistance. So, women, and again, the Lundy and Lovejoy societies referenced at the bottom are examples of two locally based organizations that women were forming to both provide for community needs, so providing for the needs of their neighbors, while also providing for the needs of freedom seekers. So women were clearly very busy and on the front lines of this movement. Civil disobedience, I think we've made some references to that. Certainly, looking back to that excerpt from the preamble to the Declaration of Independence and putting that up alongside of the laws of the period that were very much in both state and federal laws that were very much supporting the maintenance and continuation of this institution of slavery. What we like to reference, if I could go back to this image here, the old notion of running away. This image speaks about the question of who owns one's labor. Frederick Douglass comments that in one of his autobiographies that the fugitive was a fugitive because he was stealing his own labor. Of course, then that brings up, as I said, the question for us, who owns that labor? And so that choice to criminalize oneself because of choosing to claim ownership of one's labor, remove ownership from the owner or the master, certainly puts this kind of escape and into the category of civil disobedience. There was a reference a little bit earlier to fugitive slave laws of the period. These, again, they were federal laws. They applied to every state in the nation. And the 1793 federal fugitive slave law certainly had some teeth to it, but it was expected to be implemented by local magistrates, local sheriffs, who in some cases were a little sympathetic to this anti-slavery cause. So that, plus some other efforts on the part of the state of Pennsylvania to assert its states' rights over federal rights, the 1850 federal fugitive slave law was put into effect with more strength, with more teeth. As you can see by reading that little description. The other piece that's not spelled out here too, in terms of the choice, sort of the looking, understanding this history as a movement of civil disobedience, is that in 1850, U.S. commissioners were put in charge to implement the 1850 federal fugitive slave law. If I were to approach a U.S. commissioner with someone in tow and present to the commissioner that this person, in fact, is who I was looking for and escaped from Mrs. Sally Smith down in South Carolina, the person I brought before the commissioner had no right to speak for himself or herself. It was all in my word, whatever documentation I could produce. The U.S. commissioner would make a decision on whether or not the person I brought before him was in fact the person I was seeking. If the U.S. commissioner decided, nope, that's not who you're looking for, the person you brought before me has a right to go free, the U.S. commissioner would be paid $5 by the federal government. If the U.S. commissioner decided, yep, in fact, that's who you're looking for, this person needs to go back, this person's a criminal, a fugitive, the U.S. commissioner got $10. So here we have, what does that say about a system of justice? So, that in a very broad way was certainly, something very supportive of this institution. But additionally, there, again, as I mentioned earlier, even after 1827, there were state laws that still protected the enslaver-enslaved relationship for people coming into New York State from a state that allowed the institution of slavery.
Yeah. Hang on to that question. We'll come back to it.
All right, just one comment. 1850, $1,000 fine.
Yes.
What would that convert to in today's?
Can I answer that just very quickly? I have to admit a certain degree of uncertainty because I have looked at that and I've seen different responses. So I'm willing to, anyone here who might have an answer more certain than mine.
Yeah.
About $20,000.
Okay,
Yeah.
we'll go with that because, so we're talking some big bucks, yeah. Thank you for asking that.
Yeah. This idea of language and public memory as being important. One of the early renditions of our talk, we used to say people of courage, people of hope, seekers of justice. Again, it was a different way of understanding and apprehending the idea of the Underground Railroad than the way that it's traditionally put forward. Recognizing that the people really who were involved, both the passengers and the operators, were all people of courage and people of hope and seeking justice.
These two artifacts were what really spurred Paul and me on to begin to think very seriously about this language of notion. The notion of language. Let's put that Coming from an educational classroom setting, standard retelling oftentimes continues to use master, slaveholder, slave, slavery. And when we saw these were being contributed to an exhibit at the Harriet Tubman home when we were down there, also contributing a few items. And we were so struck when we saw these, I have to tell you personally, it gave me the shivers, because here are these objects used on human beings. And I started to think about, and then we talked about, the violence and the horrific tragedy and oppression represented by these objects. The shackles and then the collar, this being a very modest affair in comparison to some that were designed and used. But then as we stood and looked at these, that's what really triggered us to start thinking about the courage, the bravery, the tenacity of people who were confronting this oppressive institution on a daily basis, and those who, as abolitionists, chose to oppose it. And it really gave us pause to think about the language that we use. Do we talk about master, or do we talk about enslaver? Do we talk about slavery as if it's something that just happened and continued of its own accord, or do we talk about an institution of slavery, suggesting the moral, the social, and the legal supports that allowed it to grow and continue? Do we talk about runaway slave or fugitive, or do we talk about freedom seeker? As Paul so often says, you say it better than I, or self-agency.
Oh, yes.
And, people who choose to escape conditions of enslavement do so out of self-determination.
Yeah.
And so, not that we would ever change or ever support changing any of the language in the documents, but yet, how do we retell this history? Whose voice do we hear? What is the balance of power communicated by the language that we use? And in turn, then, how do we pass this history on to those who follow us? So this whole notion of language has become very important to both the reclaiming and retelling of this history.
And of course, as we reclaim and retell this history, the central figures in the story, of course, are the freedom seekers. And so we're going to present a few stories here. Moses Viney, who's a person who settled in this region. He settled in Schenectady. He escaped with a friend in Easter morning, early 1840s, made his way up into the Hudson Valley, spent some time in Troy, and eventually settled in Schenectady. His story is available to us in part because he worked for Eliphalet Knott, who, as you may remember, was at one time pastor of the First Presbyterian Church in Albany, president of RPI, and president of Union College. Busy guy. So Moses Viney worked for him for a period of time, and then after Eliphalet Knott died, Knott left some money to Moses, and Moses organized his own coach taxi service, which he continued in the early 20th century. Harriet Jacobs, we talked about. Did you want to talk about her?
Yeah, just very, very quickly. Her narrative, and again, I don't claim to do justice here in
North Carolina.
In a minute or two, but Harriet Jacobs, for those of you who are not familiar with her story, does, through her narrative, relate very gripping and descriptive account of what it's like, certainly for a woman to be enslaved, but then also in her accounting, she does tell us about how she spent 7 years hiding in a crawl space in her free grandmother's shed. A rather interesting contrast to those notions that go with escape. One of the particularly, I think, poignant pieces, at least for me personally as a mother, as a parent, is that she had to decide what to do with her 2 children, for whom she did not want to leave them in the hands of the man who claimed ownership of her. And so she tells us again in great detail, though I would tend to say in somewhat Victorian style, that what this experience was like. But it is her voice that fills us in on the realities of this situation.
James Beulah, a person who came to the capital region in the mid-1840s, was here long enough to be in the city directories, but with his family, was pursued by slave catchers in Albany, eventually moved to, fled to Canada, and eventually settled in the area near Syracuse, New York.
maybe if I could just quickly say the examples of James Beulah, Harriet Jacobs, Moses Minor, each of them were confronted with the decision to stay or to go. Each one of them had experiences in their life here in New York State that challenged their freedom, that made it unsafe for them to stay where they were. And so here are people who've set up, and if you can just imagine your own self, choosing a place to live, trying to work to establish yourself, make a life for yourself, family members, if they should be with you, and then having someone come into the community who you know challenges your freedom and your safety, and so needing to leave everything behind and move on to another place. And yet this was, again, part and parcel of life for people who chose to escape enslavement.
In the Free States.
In the Free State, yes.
And of course, relevance for today. There are a number of these issues that were part of a conflict that eventually resulted in the Civil War that were never completely resolved. The book "Slavery by Another Name" illustrates the story of how even though the amendment was passed, the Constitution that said that slavery would no longer be allowed in the country, what it actually said was that slavery by individuals would no longer be allowed in the country, which was a loophole that some states in the South used to round up large numbers of black men, imprison them, and then rent out their labor to private companies. And so the slavery during the Jim Crow period, the slavery that we thought had been abolished in the Civil War, was actually transformed into something else. And of course, today, everybody's talking about the new Jim Crow in terms of the criminal justice system, the fact that it creates a whole class of people who are basically have their rights taken away, can no longer and never really get back into society once having been incarcerated. So again, the struggles, the issues, things that people were grappling with in terms of the Underground Railroad story are still kind of with us today in other forms. But once again, document-based, myth versus reality, secret versus public, movement, not safe houses, the role of African Americans in leadership positions, civil disobedience, the importance of language, and its relevance for today. These are all important ways of understanding the Underground Railroad story, and we have numerous other slides, but we're going to spare you that. And if you have any questions, did you want to?
No, what I was just going to say, while we're entertaining questions, if I could just pass out some literature that we brought with us. And there's I don't know that if we don't have, if you want to take more for other people to spread the word, we always appreciate that help. So, questions?
Okay, yes.
Can we turn
Elena? Good. Okay, let's see. Who first?